All right, today is the day, and we have a little problem, as you can see. I don't know if I'm going to really call it a problem. It is something that we knew was going to happen. That we came with a radiator out of a truck that had a little more frontal area that was free and clear. But in the Leviathan, even though the cab is bigger, we have an area where we've had to kind of bring everything up out of the way because we're going to have, as remember, a bolt hole up there. So we need to move the cooling system up in tighter underneath the cab. And as you can see in the last little struggle, that is not going to be possible by putting the original radiator in there. Now, we knew this was coming up, but we have a solution today. I just came across a company called Alloy Works, and they sell automotive products, and one of the main things that they sell are radiators. Now, interestingly, in this, they also have one of the few websites where they have, I'd probably guess thousands of different radiators, but they always have the dimensions of the radiators. And we have to create a new system. Rather than using the original radiator out of the Silverado truck, we're going to go to a different setup. And to do that, we have to use actually a dual radiator setup. And that dual radiator is just to create enough surface area to match what was existing originally in the Silverado. So anyway, Alloy Works was so kind as to actually kind of be a sponsor to this episode of the channel. And they have sent us a couple of radiators. After some dimensions and checking with their website, we have gotten the radiators in that we're going to use to create our new system. And it is going to be a dual radiator system, like I said, to create as much surface area to match the original Silverado's surface area. And in fact, we don't have to really go quite as much surface area, even though we're actually going a little more. But we have radiators that are going to have multiple cores rather than just a single flat core area. Here is our first, and we'll see in just a moment how those are going to fit in there. But let's see what we got. Now they do have mostly original OEM replacement systems, so you can go in there and just put in the year, make, and model of your vehicle and get a replacement radiator. Or they have specialized radiators, and as you can see, we just went by dimensions. And number two, coming up. Again, packed in here, it looks like they use a expanding foam system to basically fit them right exactly to the box. Pull some of those expanded foam chunks out of there. Oh, keep these in order, but actually we don't need to get it back in the box, we need to get it on the vehicle, huh? And there. Now this one is a triple core, and this one has, of course, we'll see in just a minute, we'll get out of the bag here. This one has the fan system on it, so it will be between the engine and the radiator, so we can use the fan on this one to draw air through both of them. Okay, get all this out of the way. There's the primary core, and then we have the others to go with it. I said they'll total up to the surface area we needed of the original. Anyway, let's start building some brackets, get these things installed. Let's jump in, take a look at that. Well, the first thing we're going to do is jump into Alloy Works website. Then jump into the radiator section. Although they have other parts, we're after radiators. And you can select by make and model of your vehicle, but we're just going to start randomly scrolling through, looking at different radiators, see what might fit. When we find something that looks intriguing, jump in, take a look at their specs and dimensions. Of course, we need dimensions to make sure it's going to fit in our application. Now, there is certainly a great selection to wander through here, with about 38 pages in just the area I was scrolling through trying to find what I needed. And I really appreciate that they have such great descriptions on their website, whereas a lot of auto parts places just have basically a pretty generic description and then a place where you can put in your make and model and tells you where it fits or not. They're pretty high quality when they showed up. Had these nice billet machined radiator caps rather than the cheap sheet metal ones that just kind of a stamped sheet metal ones. Also a pretty good fit and weld on all their TIG and all their fittings. And even the little adapters for your cap, or I should say the filler spout, was all a machined piece of aluminum as well. One good thing, it had serial numbers laser engraved on the side, because if I have to replace this thing, I can't just go ask for a Leviathan radiator. And the electrical parts for that radiator that had the fan with the thermostat and relay all ready to go. The only problem I found in this radiator is on one weld, had a little bit of a high bump there where the termination on the weld occurred. And it probably wouldn't have been a problem to anybody else, but it actually hung down just low enough that touched my bracket. And so rather than having it squeak and squawk down the road, I just ground it off. Now I will try to show you what's going to go on in here as best I can, but with this camera and all the pieces in the way, you're just going to have to kind of use your imagination and part of it, I guess. But right back here, you can see down there, there's the steering box, and right behind it, this little pole sticking up, that is the shaft that used to go back to the steering column. But we're actually going to have a reversing box mounted right there that turns the steering shaft, and it comes forward back towards where the camera is right now. So between this brace right here, we have to have a little window right here that we can't have in your radiator, because that's where the steering column is actually going to come back this way. So we have this area right in here to fill in, and of course it goes up a little bit in there, and that's where these two radiators are going to go. One right in here to fit everywhere except for that little part right there, then the other one right in front of the engine. That'll be the one with the fan. Okay, so we have to slide those in here and kind of see where they're going to fit and figure out how we're going to build a bracket to hold them. Of course, that bracket has to be ready for rubber isolation and to affix things to the chassis rather than to the cab here, because if you remember, the cab moves independently of the chassis somewhat on those cantilevered shock-mounted suspension pieces. Well, now we're ready to test fit these radiators that have shown up. Just going to slide them in right close to the position they're in just to verify. I hate to start building brackets and find out it just doesn't work. First radiator is going to sit right about that position. Then the bigger radiator with the fan is going to sit pretty close to straight in front of the engine. And we need to build a base mount for all these things, and it's going to attach to these little tabs off of the chassis. They used to be the cab mounting brackets, well, the very front ones that would have held the front of the quarter panels. Now we know everything's going to work in there and what our dimensions on the outside on the vehicle are. We need to get a few more dimensions off of these radiators. I need to kind of know where that peg in the middle there lines up. A couple of the other brackets or fittings on top on the radiator that didn't really show up on the website. Of course, you wouldn't expect them to. We get all that information, going to throw all that into AutoCAD, create some drawings to send off to the water jet cutter. And what I get back is some sheet metal, some 1/8 inch sheet metal, and they did some bends for me on this. Bent one into a C channel and one into an S channel, and those two pieces fit together to make kind of a box section. You also see that there's a couple of 1-inch square tubing that fit through these box sections, little square holes that they cut in there for me. They help to line the thing, but they are going to be upright braces for the top part. They'll have some little feet welded to those 1-inch square tubing that'll create the attachment point for the upright braces. Now I'm going to have some way to attach all this stuff together once it goes back in. So even those 1-inch or 1/8 of an inch sheet metal, you could tap it and put some threads in there, but we're going to add some rib nuts just to give it a little more bite and connection. Now I'm putting some rib nuts in an area here that's going to be an additional bracket that'll help tie it in another position to the main brace of the chassis. All these upright sections and extra braces need to be fixed pretty solidly. These uprights, of course, have to fit in, but they are going to interfere with the frame if they don't come into pieces. And this one, of course, even had to be truncated once more to be able to get it in to fit there. And I'm just adding a little insert section where the tube was cut so that I can be able to slide the tube back together and put a bolt through it. Now with all these pieces, the upright pieces built, it's time to kind of test assemble this thing on the bench. Now once these things get filled with coolant, of course the center of gravity is going to shift a lot higher and they might start to flop around in some rough terrain. So to create more of a box section of the two upright frames for the radiator, we're going to create some brackets that are going to tie the two uprights together. Now the first one is kind of a 45 degrees, and this one here has got two 90-degree bends. It kind of has to go around one radiator and hook to the backside of the second frame. Now this is all part of the same system that has to fit together and be bolted in place. So cut some flat bar, weld those to the bottom of each one of these braces, and I'll drill those out later so that we can use those as some attachment points. Drill through those, put some rib nuts into the brace itself, and they'll fit. Like I said, the 45 like that. The one at the double bend, it'll go around the radiator, fit to the brace like that. Well, we're ready to put the radiator in place, but before we do that, if we do that, it's going to be an interference for me being able to accomplish a couple other things, and that is that there are three other subsystem cooling in here. We have the transmission cooling, an oil cooling system, and the power steering brake system cooling. So we need to do some rearrangement of the plumbing there so that we have some room to actually work around with the tools in there, get something cut off and hoses replaced. But let me show you what we're talking about. You get in here, we have this transmission cooler, hoses back behind it. There are all these bent angles that of course worked really well on the Silverado, but it's no longer such a Silverado anymore. Same thing over here. We got these bent lines coming up from the oil cooling. We need them to just come down and up and hook to a new cooler we're going to put on here. The only one that is going to stay, if we swing around this way, is this little unit. This is for power steering and brakes, the hydraulic system there, and it's just going to attach to the rail up here. So let's go get some tools, start working on this thing. Now this thing has a little bit of a problem, and these hard lines have got some pretty jagged bends in them, and I can't get them to go back through the little narrow passage. But that's okay, because we kind of want to know where they're going to be cut off in general so that we can get a measurement of our new flexible hoses are going to go to. So I just grabbed myself a little pipe cutter, a few spins, nip them things right off, and we're ready to kind of take a measurement, figure out where our flexible hoses are going to go. Cut off, we got the cut off right there, and then this is the hose that's flipped around now, but it goes through a little hole back there to the oil. With these oddball brackets or oddball coolers that were on the Silverado not going to fit in here, what am I going to do? Well, luckily, just happens to be that Alloy Works makes this nice little multi-core oil transmission cooler. And we're going to convert two of those to run one on the oil system and one on the transmission side. And they're going to sit somewhere right about here. Put them side by side here. You can see the difference in the thickness of the core, how many layers of core they are compared to the original. This is the transmission cooler. Thin, not much flow through the thing. Kind of a strange bracket up here that we're not going to be able to use. Look, it's stick way down here. Just nowhere for us to put that thing. And of course, like we said, all these bends I had to deal with. No way to recreate those very easily. When all we need now, we'll just run braided steel hose up to these corners and hook into the radiators. Will be in each of these corners. Radiators, well, I should say heat exchangers more accurately. One in each coil, one for the oil, one for the transmission. They also kind of sit in that corner and flank the main radiators. We need to get our measurement for our flexible hoses that are going to go up to those little heat exchangers. Now you can grab a piece of rope. I just grabbed an extension cord here. Nice and flexible, will kind of lay right in the position that the hoses will go. And then I can just measure off that piece of cord to get the measurement I need. Now I can just take the measurement into the shop and get this hoses built. Now to transition from the rubber hoses that we need, taken our rigid lines off the engine and the transmission, brought them in. I need to get a AN fitting that does a transition from the hard line to the flex line. And that's a 37-degree flare that's required for the AN fittings. Now when you do this, you have to make sure you remember to put your fittings on before you do the flare, or else it's meaning you're going to have to cut them off and start over. Next thing we're going to do is put the flares back in and our fittings in. We got some flexible lines created. I'll show you the creation of those flexible lines in another video. But we're going to take our newly flared lines and flexible hoses and go out and slide them back through the little channel. The little passage you see in the side of the engine goes right beside the engine along or above the chassis cross members. This one here is the transmission coolant line on the left side. And then over on the right we have the oil coolant lines. Snake them through. We need to feed these up and put them in a position, as you saw before, connected to those little heat exchangers. Now the astute observer may notice that these are sitting right above the idler and next to the pitman arm. It's going to be going back and forth many times. We don't want them to touch the hose and wear a hole through that hose. So we need to make sure they're secured somewhere. To do that, I have some AN clamps that are going to be right underneath our frame member. They're going to attach to this cross member from the chassis. And once I drilled through it, I realized this is a pretty thin piece of sheet metal, so not much meat in there to tap into. So we're going to throw a rib nut in there, get a little more surface area for threading into. And you'll see that as the hose lays across, attaches to this cross member, we can adjust it so that it's not touching that idler arm. And yet it keeps the clamp keeps it also below the cross frame mount that we're building for the whole radiator system. And then they lead up to where those heat exchangers are going to be. I also noticed while I had all this place open that, hey, there's a bunch of Zerk fittings on this steering components. While I've got all this room, might as well grab the grease gun and put a few pumps into each fitting. I pity the fool that has to go do this after the radiators are in place. Well, actually, the radiators won't be that intrusive. There's still some room in there to get into these things, but convenient right now. Now with all that taken care of, we can start putting our base frame in. And you can see why having the uprights would be a little bit of a problem if they were attached to this thing, as it's a little bit of a moving around, jiggle around, trying to get it in there as it is. You'll notice on the left side, the little round piece of extension tubing down there. A little standoff is going to sit on a little piece of rubber, a little rubber grommet in that tab that sticks off the chassis, and that's going to be our first mounting point. The second on the other side as well. The third mounting point is a piece of sheet metal that goes down to a cross member on the chassis, right in the center on the back side of our base frame. And then of course the fourth one is a little bit to the left of that, you'll see later. Get those things all bolted in place, and then we have a rigid structure to start putting the rest of our framework together. Now this is that upright framework that we ended up truncating to be able to fit in there. With it bolted in place, our first radiator is sliding in ready to go. Little pegs on the bottom of the radiator fit in the rubber grommets. It swings in, and we can bolt it to the tabs on the top. Second radiator, same thing. We got our uprights that slide in. There's no cross member on the second one, but we do see the feet here. Put our bolt through, tighten that down, and then are ready for our main radiator to drop in. Same thing, little peg in the middle goes in the rubber grommet, bolts on the top. And with the two radiators kind of bolted into place, it's we have our secondary bracing that's going to tie the two uprights together. Our little 45 on the left here, and our little double bend brace on to the right. And with that, we're ready to move on. Okay, here's the connection. It's got to come out here, make a 45-degree straight into that. Okay, over here. This one down there has to make a 90. Come across here, but come and then come up and over and into that. So 90 and a 90 with a 45 down there, likely to tilt up. Down in the back here, this one's got to go forward, make a 90, come across, and then make a hard U into there. Now that we know where we're going, it's time to start playing plumbing works. Now I picked up a bunch of radiator hose and some rigid radiator pipe. But one of the things is I couldn't find a piece of rigid pipe that was long enough for one of the runs, so I just happened to have a piece of 1 1/4 inch aluminum tubing. I just welded a bead around each end just to make sure that I had a secure connection for the pipe clamp to hold that rubber hose on that end. Now you can often get radiator hoses with sometimes up to 5 different angled bends on it, and cut those up and use them to make all the transitions you need. Well, in one of the fittings I needed another rigid piece of pipe, but I had one that was actually longer than I needed and tried to shorten it up. But this time it was a piece of chrome plated steel, and trying to weld it, the zinc went to pot and created a terrible mess. Besides, we just tried to throw it in there anyway just to make sure everything fit. With all of our fittings selected, our hoses and a rigid pipe, it's time to start putting this thing together. Putting rigid into the flexible, fitting that onto the pump side, fitting that onto the radiator side, and putting all the clamps together. Now this piece here, the last one going in, is that piece of chrome plated pipe that we're going to be replacing. And it also needs the transition from 1 1/4, 1 3/8. So the piece we ordered will be doing all that transitioning and doing the run at the right length and not be such a mess from welding on galvanized material. And with that, we have most of our plumbing done. And let me show you a little tour of where the fluid's going to flow. So, high pressure coming off the pump, goes in the top of the radiator, flows through the radiator, exits at the bottom, that's the far side hose down there, comes across, if you can see at the bottom, a little hose down there, going around into the top of the low radiator, around, well, here we go, there's this bottom radiator, comes out, comes up the hill, makes a loop down in to the thermostat housing on the low side. And that's the flow of our cooling system. Well, there we go. We have the radiator side of the cooling done, and we'd like to thank Alloyworks for sponsoring this video. Make sure you jump down, take a visit to their website. Also, right now, if you use the code BuilderCreator, you can get 8% off on anything you purchase on the site. But we are glad to get this far along in the project, and we'll be moving on with the cooling side of the oil, transmission, and the power steering. That'll be coming up soon. But thank you for stopping by today. Come back, see us again.